So basically, I hope at the end of this little talk, you guys feel comfortable like doing some sustainable pruning on your own trees, and also just like understanding how trees should be and what's good work, what's bad work, and if you hire professionals, I hope like that you can see that they're doing a good job or versus a bad job. You kind of just have a better understanding of how trees work in general. So one thing I wanted to talk about first was just when to prune. We want the trees to be dormant because they put a lot of energy into their branches, and a lot of people don't realize that when you cut off a branch, you're severing all that nutrition and resource that is in that branch. So the best time is fall, like late fall, winter, and then early spring. And that's also the best climate. So I'm trying to tell people, help me do my job. Please hire me in the winter. I might not be around in the summer. I might be dead.
So
yeah.
dormant just means like the tree isn't growing.
The tree is, yeah, it's not undergoing transpiration as much. So it's not like the lifeblood's not moving through it quite as much, especially with citrus. Like citrus, you don't really need to even water in the winter. That can cause a lot of like root problems if you're watering when the tree's not soaking that water up, because it'll just sit there and that's a bad thing. That can cause rot. I guess the other time to prune is just like before failure, because if it's in the middle of the summer, the tree's super stressed out, but there's something that's gonna break in a storm, it'd be better to take care of that in a manageable way rather than have that break and then you are your best tree's witness. Like no one sees your trees as much as you do. You know, you see them every day, and if you see something happening, you're like, what's going on? Like, it's a longer timeline than our human lives. So like something could have happened 3 years ago, or a root could have been cut, and then now you're just seeing signs of it in the canopy. Because the canopy shows us what's happening to the root system and to the whole tree in general. So trying to sort of deduce what's happening has a lot to do with like the recent history. The best kind of pruning is just minimal pruning over time, constantly adjusting things and helping it grow to its natural habit. We have really strange trees here in the desert. They grow in the weirdest ways, but they're doing that for a purpose, so we're trying to understand them better. But basically, yeah, you see all the Palo Verdes and the mesquites. We don't have pines. Even the pines here, like the Aleppo pines, they just grow all wonky and crazy like that. It's important to like understand why the tree is trying to like weed down and grow like that, so that you can then prune it in a way that will help it grow into its natural form, but also let you live your life underneath it or do what you need to do, you know. So a lot of people hack at trees, and that makes it a bigger problem down the line. And each tree has different structure and should be managed uniquely. So like we're not going to prune that Palo Verde the same way we prune a mesquite. But for instance, like that Palo Verde, we just took like the top bit out of. I don't know if you guys were here recently, but it was super tall. And Palo Verdes have strong structure, but the wood is kind of weak, so they can kind of break. And you've probably seen that all over town after a storm. They just have these unions that can fall apart. The best management is just kind of keeping it within parameters so it can sustain itself and not get out of control. The other thing we have a lot of in Arizona is sun. And so the trees are constantly growing towards that, and sometimes they outcompete themselves. So like one branch can shade out other branches and become like the apical dominant branch, which is good, but then it can also deform the rest of the tree. And so that little constant pruning can kind of make it so that everything can be a little bit symbiotic, even within its own canopy. A lot of what we do in Tucson is a reduction cut. So it's reducing like the weight from the tip, bringing it back in, or reducing the height, so it's not like getting ripped around by the wind, and we're bringing that down. So to do those kind of cuts, we want to bring it back to a lateral that is a third the size of the diameter of the branch. Yeah, so if we wanted to take this off, we'd have to come back here. Otherwise, if we cut it out here, it would just sucker out, and that would make a lot of, the tree's trying to protect itself from that wound, or protect that wound. And so it's going to make a lot of new growth that's not going to be very helpful, and it's going to be kind of gross to look at and really probably spiky. And so by doing that, you can kind of divert all the energy and the nutrient into that lateral, and then the tree won't die back. So we can work with like the biology of the tree. Yeah, so everybody knows what a lion's tail is, or what it looks like. It's just like a tail, and then at the end it's got a tuft, you know. It's kind of like a Dr. Seuss drawing. And so sometimes it is necessary to prune to get like home projects done. And so like keeping it within the limits of the tree and knowing those limits is like kind of the part of the pruning that's important, is being like, that's too much. Usually they say you can't take more than like 30% of the canopy. But it really is case by case. Certain trees have access to a lot of water, and you can kind of take a lot off of them. And that's the other thing is like about the culture is like people come from out of town, and they're like, this is what a tree should look like, a piece of broccoli. And you can make those trees like on the East Coast look like that, and that's what people like. That's how a child would draw a tree, but that's not how these trees look. And so we just gotta roll with it. You can't change that. Well, the issue with lion's tailing is it. Not only does it expose the bark and the tree to like too much sunlight where it can't protect itself, it also takes away the option to reduce it back to a lateral. So if all we have is just that stuff out at the end, and we don't want that anymore, or it's getting in the way, it's hitting the roof, there's no option to bring it back. So if you take every branch up until then eventually you're gonna have to take the whole branch. And then on that same note, a lot of times people will prune, like this is a good example, people will prune the branch that they're like, this is in my way, right? Yeah. But the reason it's growing like that is because branches above it are like growing down over it. And so it's like, oh, I'm gonna do that too. And so I call it like the touchdown catch. Like it's trying to get the sunshine that is available. But if you only prune this branch, you're going to end up with something like this because there'll be nothing to work with. You need to work with the upper and the middle canopy. And that's where it might be necessary to hire someone to climb it or to get a ladder and just to start, because you need to focus on like the whole Fibonacci pattern. You know, you need to think about the tree as a whole. A lot of these mesquites actually don't have that central tie-in to the central lead. And so they're kind of like each individual trees of their own on each branch.
So is this a healthy tree or not healthy?
This is a healthy tree. I mean, it's happy. It's putting off new growth. It's housing wildlife. It's just performing its role as a tree, I guess. You know, and it's not like in a dire strait of like dying back. Although it has had really huge wounds like this, and so this like most likely happened during a storm, and this branch was too heavy, and then it broke at the union. And sometimes what we can get right here is sometimes rot can develop in this branch bark union, and then water can get in there and slowly just rot out the wood, and that's when something like this will happen in combination with the end weight being too heavy. So a lot of the times it's not just one thing, it's like a few abiotic factors mixed with the fact that it's too hot and it got hit by a truck. It's like all these things all at once. You have to consider why it's happening, why it's growing like that. And now you can see this entire space right here is open, and so all these other branches are like moving into that space. Try to maintain the natural growth habit, and then it's always preferable to regularly remove small branches rather than periodically remove a bunch of larger branches. As a homeowner, once a year is a great idea. After Thanksgiving.
Or even just have an arborist come out and say,
Yeah.
you know, there's many times we come out and it's
Yeah.
just like, you don't need to do that.
Exactly.
But it's good you had us out because something could have broken in a storm, and that's something we can identify as like, cool.
Yeah. But in terms of like a professional service, I would say like they shouldn't be coming out more than once every like 3 years, because they should
prune.
be to prune. Yeah, because that means they're pruning incorrectly or the tree's growing really fast. But basically, a lot of the reason I say once a year as a homeowner is because I'm sitting there with my pole pruner and just like in my backyard when I'm bored, and I'm just like making small adjustments to this tree I have, and I'll do that maybe once or twice a year because it's fun and I can.
Okay,
But
for
like,
the average person.
but for the average person, yeah, like because the other thing that's going to happen a lot is branches grow in length. That's the primary growth, and then secondary growth is they grow in width. Okay, so a lot of the times you're going to get these really stringy branches that are like reaching towards your window or your car, and that is going to, unfortunately, it's going to happen like twice a year. You got spring, and you've got second spring or monsoon season where everything just gets so much sunlight and so much water that they're like, let's do it again. And so sometimes those like apical growths, those like tiny little things, you're just gonna want to nip real quick yourself. And that's something that like I want to empower you guys to do, because you can do that and then you don't have to hire people on. By starting with cleanup pruning, the removal of small branches, usually like dead and just like kind of knocking stuff out that's like hanging. The general form of the tree is more apparent, and then you can stop periodically and take a step back from the tree like an artist working on a painting, take in an overall view of the tree from all sides, identify problem areas, and then begin pruning again. And then you repeat this process several times while pruning. And then recall that excessive branch removal or improper or inappropriate pruning can act to stimulate additional unwanted growth. Corrective pruning can stimulate desired growth or reduce and better control growth and form. A good arborist will tell you no, and also will tell you why they're doing what they're doing. And it should be like a haircut. It should be like, wow, you just look great. I don't know what it is. And it'll be like, oh, you got your haircut. Like, it's like you don't notice it, but it helps. Yeah, it helps so much. Yeah.
It's the hard thing about Arizona pruning. It's like, well, if I'm paying for it, I want to see a difference.
Exactly.
It's like you see all these trees that just get completely gutted because it's like, oh yeah, I got my tree trimmed, right? But usually that's not the case.
Call it giraffe pruning because I mean, and no offense to anyone who does this type of labor, but like there's like a lot of landscapers with that pole saw. It's a mechanized saw that they can just be like, they just butcher things, and it's bad cuts, and they basically do everything, and then they're like, well, I can't reach that, so that's the tree. So that's why I call it giraffe pruning. And some of these acacias come from the desert, and that's what's happening in like the Serengeti in Africa. They're getting eaten, and so that's why they look like that classic shape. But what they're trying to do is grow out like that, and they're trying to grow down to protect their root ball. They're trying to keep themselves shaded. The mesquites do a lot of self-pruning, so like they'll have things die, but then the idea is that'll die, and the bean pods will drop, and then they're self-fertilizing, and they fix nitrogen into the soil. And so it's like a really beautiful cycle. If you ever go on a hike, look at what trees look like in nature, like in a riparian area or like just in the middle of the desert. Like a real Palo Verde is like this tall, and it's like, you know, but we have these hybrids, and we've like given them the resource to become actual trees because that's what we want. But like some of these plants are just meant to be like suffering little bushes. I love to mulch things. I also have the wood chipper, so I'm also trying to use that material. But that's what trees need. Like they need it. If a tree is like this exposed, it gets the soil, like it's heated up by the sun. The water runs away from the root ball, and there is none of that decomposition going on, which is basically the dead leaves become the tree again, you know, and it's a beautiful cycle. Another way to not be in conflict with trees is be like, oh, all this stuff that just fell out, we'll just scoot it to the base of the tree, and you'll just make like maybe a little rock ring or something, and you're like, that's where it goes. And you'll be surprised at how quickly it just breaks down. So you'll be like, oh, we put all these mesquite pods and it looks ridiculous, and then like it'll just sit down and it'll compost itself. Yeah, like my yard is like 10 degrees cooler than the street because it's just mulch everywhere. Why do we prune a tree? For health and aesthetics. Usually aesthetics is like a high on people's list. You know, especially people who are a little detached. They're like, I don't know, it just looks weird, you know. And then safety. I would say those are like the three main ones: safety, health, and aesthetics. Ways we can deal with that. There's a few terms. One is end weight reduction, so that's basically taking weight out of the end of the branches so that it doesn't stress the unions nearer towards the trunk. It's sort of like when you buy a hiking shoe and they say a pound on your foot, it's like 10 on your back. So it's like the cantilever of that weight is, especially when it gets ripped around by a windstorm, is enough to make these trees fall apart. But not if you keep them light and keep them within their own parameters. Height clearance, I think it needs to be 8 feet over sidewalks and 14 over or 15 over the street. That's like a city regulation. And then crown thinning. And this is kind of like back to that point I wanted to make. It's just like a lot of what people do is prune what's in their face, but you kind of need to look beyond that and see into the upper canopy and see what's going on there, because it's influencing what's happening beneath. And that usually involves climbing into the tree, or if it's like a really tall tree, like that is the part that's growing the most. And so if you came in and did a few small cuts, you could help it have great form in the long run. You know, some Aleppo pines will have like cross branching, or two trees that have a weak union. So like a good union is like a U, and a weak union is a V, and they have this sort of incomplete branch bark union that makes them easy to just rip apart. So if you can take those branches out, take the crossing branches out, that's some of the work that you can do in the tree for the long run. So one of the the hows I'd just like to focus on today is the 3-step cut method. So say I were to want to prune this off, I need to bring it back to something. So is this branch, can I bring it back to that? Probably not. I mean, it might work, and if this were my tree, I would be like, maybe I'll cut it there and see how it responds. But technically, it's not 1/3 of the diameter, so we're gonna need to bring it back to here. But to do that, if I just cut from the top down, it's gonna rip, because the living skin, the cambium, and the bark on these trees, it's very strong, so it will hold on to it. And sometimes things will break and just like fall into another branch, and then the branch will stay alive because it has like an inch of cambium that's feeding the branch still, which is pretty cool, but it's also still dangerous. So the 3-step method is basically you do an undercut. So I would do like an undercut right here, and then a top cut. So here, let's do like an undercut here, a top cut here, and then that would peel and then pop off. So that would drop. So it would be a situation where you'd want to be out of the way. And then I would do one last cut at the branch collar, perpendicular to the cambium, and that's my final pruning cut. So with trees, you can't, it's so easy to take away, you can't put it back, right? So it's best to take care of the weight and then leave a little bit left so you can do a really nice pruning cut at the end. And that's the magic to pruning is getting yourself in a position to make that really nice pruning cut, and a lot of the times you're going to have to do a lot of whittling down of a branch to get there, and that's why we have different tools. So you've got the pole pruner, the handsaw, and the snips, the hand snips. The main thing we want to avoid, so the bypass pruners are good because this is in terms of tools, these are good tools because you can see it, they pass by each other like scissors. What we don't want are like the anvil pruners where they just mash. You know, that's okay if you're like cutting a hose or something, or even then, I don't know what those are for. They're just like, they just masticate whatever they're trying to cut. So you want the bypass pruners. These work as well. These give you a little more like torque. It's a little harder to get them into the right cut. And that's why probably the best cut you're gonna get. So I'm going to show them your new saw. Something like this. This is like probably the most dangerous tool, and I actually just had an experience where I cut myself with it and it was not fun. So this is very sharp, and but it's a really good tool for getting into those small unions and then doing the 3-step cut method, and then that last stub cut, doing it really precisely. Start with a small branch. But yeah, first cut, I'm going to want to leave myself room to work with in case something does peel off and get weird. But I want to take most of the weight out of this so that when I do my stub cut, it's not too heavy and it's going to peel off, because that's going to be one cut. So I do undercut, probably about like a third or a half the way through. I do the uppercut, which can be further out if you want it to sort of lean it down and softly go to the ground, or it could be right next to it. And for something like this, I'll like stop before I'm fully through, put my tool away, and then I can just go like that. And then I'm not fighting all that wood, and I can just do this. Just do this final cut. So from the branch bark ridge to the other side, perpendicular to the branch. And usually I can just like hold on to that. And so that's a cut. And so that's one. I think that probably will let go of this whole branch, come back to here so that people can have space and we can have more light on the garden.
What about these two branches that are twisting around each other?
Yeah, so that's another thing I'd like to talk about. We can make this, we have a couple options here. So we can make this branch lift by reducing the weight on the tip so that they're not rubbing and touching each other. or we could take this all the way back, or choose one of the branches. So sometimes with mesquites, it's sometimes the opposite of what you think. So like to reduce weight on a branch or to like lift a branch, sometimes you're going to want to take the one that's actually growing upwards, and that'll keep the natural pattern, the natural habit of the tree, but also reduce weight. So something like this is kind of doing, this branch is doing something different than the rest of the branches. So it's not very heavy, but if we had that in a heavier sense, we could take the top one and it would lift up. So I'm gonna probably say that we can take like this branch and then a branch out there and leave this larger limb, and then they can kind of grow off of each other. It's okay if they're rubbing a little bit, but there's a good example right here. I don't know if you guys can see this. Should have brought a laser pointer. But that's where they're rubbing to the point where it's going to break right up in this upper bit. And so that's where it's causing a hazard. And so that's where I would basically, this isn't an issue yet, Dawn Star, but you have a good eye and you saw it. So what we can do is try to sort it out, and if it doesn't work, then we can bring it back in the years to come. But that is too far gone and we need to have a decision made about that. And so in that case, we'll get up there and find whichever branch is more healthy and has a better chance of continuing on, and we'll just take the other one. So I'm going to do that same cut again just to exemplify. Also, you can sort of see this mesquite kind of changing, looking a little red, looking kind of orangish, and that's a sign in mesquites. If the new growth isn't green like this, that's like a pretty good sign that it's dying back or being shaded out. And again, that's natural. Like they shade themselves out, and then the branch falls and it becomes part of the compost. So I'm going to go out here, undercut, upcut. Now I might have you handle this one. And then as I'm cutting, I'm going like one side, far side, close side.
Yep.
All right, and that should be good. And you see how that peeled back a little bit, but it only peeled back to my undercut. So that's okay. And now I could handle this, but I'm gonna just stub it one more time. And the difference, when we were learning how to do this, me and Patrick, they said the difference between you and a master arborist is 1,000,000 cuts. So you might make a mistake. It's okay, but you'll get better at it. And again here, branch bark ridge, straight across to the other side. Ta-da. So it's just that, over and over and over again. And then getting the eye for how it's growing, how it wants to grow, and then finding the right spots to cut it. And then one thing I like to talk about, because it's like a common thing we see all the time, is mistletoe. There's some right there. And mistletoe needs to be managed to a certain extent, but it's also has its place in the ecosystem. It's a great resource and food for birds, and it's one of those things where people think it's killing the tree. It is like a heavy parasite. So it's like it is feeding off of the tree, but it's photosynthesizing by itself. So it's sort of a parasitic symbiosis, which is kind of an oxymoron, but it's pretty cool actually.